classes, various measures for engineers and surveyors. And with that, I'll turn you over to Rick Moore.
Hello, this is Rick Moore. I'm currently the executive officer for the board, and I've worked in survey career for over 30 years. Came to California in 1990. Primarily my practice has been Ventura, Santa Barbara County area, and started working with the board, the state land surveyor exam, becoming licensed, and started as a land surveyor consultant at the board. Eventually came on as a PE and was appointed to my current position in July of 2011.
Okay, I'm Larry Carest, and my resume won't take nearly as long. I'm an enforcement analyst here with the board. I've worked with the board since January of 2005. I was hired as a licensing evaluator, which handles applications for people interested in licensure, and hired as an enforcement analyst, where I've been for the last 6 years. Enforcement analyst, I handle cases for all licensed and unlicensed activity, and I'm also the point of contact for monument conservation concerns and complaints. I began my state career about 10 years ago with Department of Corrections.
Let's get started. I have an overview of what we're going to do today. This bullet is questions, but we are taking questions all the way through the presentation, because this is really about to answer questions that we hear and questions you might have today. But the general outline of what we're going to do, we're going to talk about what monument conservation is, talk about the current issues, come with the roles and responsibilities that are out there, and about education efforts of the board, and we'll touch on what CLSA is doing also. And then we'll wrap up with questions at the end, but like I said before, don't hesitate to send your questions in via the chat. We'll address them as we can. What is conservation? Well, go to section 871 of the Business Professions Code, also known as the PLS Act to us surveyors. It talks in great length about what monument conservation is. But in general, protect existing survey monuments before they are destroyed by public works projects. That's the real crux of what we're talking about today. Right here we're talking about a little bit of legislative history. There's a lot of people in touch with monument conservation that they think is something fairly new. They've got a magic date of 1984, or they've got various dates that are out there, but basically it hasn't changed in the LS Act since 1957. The only changes that were more recent was 1995, introduced pre- and post-construction document requirements. And then 1998 is split the 71 up to sections A, B, and C. We're going to go over in detail about what the current law is right now, and with Larry.
And what I do is I read the law, or how we have it on each slide. And after I read what's on the slide, I was going to give my opinion as an unlicensed person, as sort of a layman, just give a different perspective. So maybe somebody who's not licensed has an idea of what they're reading into it, or how they're deciphering it. And maybe, Ray, we can just discuss it.
I can interject some things, and maybe even Rick as well.
Okay. So let's go with 8771B. When monuments exist that control the location of subdivisions, tracks, boundaries, roads, streets, or highways, or provide horizontal or vertical survey control, the monument will be located and referenced or under the direction of a licensed land surveyor or registered civil engineer prior to the time when any streets, highways, right-of-ways, rights-of-way, or easements are improved, constructed, reconstructed, maintained, resurfaced, or relocated, and a record or record of survey of the references should be filed with the county surveyor. The way I kind of read it, it's to me that when a public works project is going to be performed, all of the existing monuments within the project need to be located and documented with the county surveyor's office. That's how I read it.
Larry, that's a pretty good reading of it, I would say. I think that it's important to look at and identify some of the things we've underlined. It's about existing monuments. Of course, what a survey monument is, and that's something that controls that property right. And it is horizontal or vertical as the law was recently updated. But monuments shall be located in reference to the direction of someone licensed to practice land surveying. That could be a pre-82 civil engineer or a licensed as a land surveyor. That, keep in mind, it has to be someone who is authorized to do that work. And the other steps are, it needs to be prior to the time when the streets are improved or constructed. Maintained, resurfaced. And I can tell you right now, resurfaced is an issue that we talk to many times public agencies because they don't understand that a slurry seal counts as resurfacing. And keep in mind, this doesn't just talk about local public works agency. This could be other improvements. Southern California Medicine, water companies, communication. Improvements are going on within these right-of-ways are basically shown. Have that responsibility to maintain that.
Okay, we'll move to the next slide. Shall be reset in the surface of the new construction, a suitable monument box placed thereon, or permanent witness monument set to perpetuate their location. If a monument could be destroyed, damaged, covered, or otherwise obliterated, and a corner record or record of survey filed with the county surveyor prior to the recording of the certificate of completion for the project. Again, as sort of a layman, I think suitable monument box is probably the one that sticks out to me because suitable seems like kind of a subjective word. That and also the part about the corner record or the record of survey, which is a choice. And I'm wondering who decides on which is going to be filed.
This law seems out of place with it when you look at a flow of what monument conservation is. And that's because it's actually one of the older pieces. This language hasn't changed one bit. And the whole monument box is something that most of surveyors would recognize as a cap-well monument or a monument type box. Where's a perhaps similar to a water valve put in the center of the road or over a monument that protects that, where you could pull that cap off and dig out the water, the mud, the muck, whatever, and reach the mark without having to the surface of the improvement. And you talk about who does what to buy. That's actually covered later on in the law, but just a real quick tip. The surveyor who's doing the monument preservation, or the person authorized to practice surveying, is the one who makes that choice. We've underlined a few of the kind of highlights of this. I think it's good to go review that. They do reset in the new surface. Now, if you're going to do a monument box or a permanent witness marker, this needs to be in the surface of the new construction. And here's a real word in this law is perpetuate. We use the word monument conservation. You've heard the word monument preservation. And CSA is kind of, with our partnering, we use this term monument conservation to distinguish between monument preservation or the survey monument preservation fund, which is in the code for county surveyors. It's not to confuse them. That being said, this section pretty much speaks for itself. Any questions on the chat room, so you guys go and send the questions up there, or we'll just probably through this. But you want to go on to the next slide there, Rick?
Sure. Controlling monuments shall be retained or replaced in their original positions to enable property, right-of-way, and easement lines, property corners, and subdivision and tract boundaries to be reestablished without devious surveys necessarily originating on monuments differing from those that currently control the area. Sufficient, kind of to me, is the objective word. What's considered to be sufficient, maybe one person views it differently than somebody else does. The other one, kind of humorous to me, is devious. I think that, I of course have my own connotations, and I'm sure in the surveying world that devious surveys are, it falls into play here, but devious surveys necessarily originating on monuments differing from those that control the area is probably something that I could be a little more educated on.
Oh, at this point, if someone can identify the graphic that showed up, the birds on the chat room, we'll get 5 gold stars, okay? And may to be redeemed at a later date. Backing up to your first question, Larry, sufficient definitely is a subjective term. This professional opinion comes in. Everyone might say that 10 monuments destroyed out there, and I put 1 in, and that's sufficient. Well, literally the standard of care would not be sufficient. The same stretch of road where you have center sections, and in between there's some intermediate monuments. All those monuments may not be necessary to replace, especially if they don't have any pedigree or research that identifies those. So sufficient might just be the centerline intersections. But that's a project decision that really the land surveyor, and I'd recommend them partnering with the agency that oversees that infrastructure that's out there. You know, devious, you know, I guess an old term, none of us are devious, but the reality is these records, your survey records, need to be in the public record. So it doesn't have to go and pay the fee because you've got them in your records, or pay a research fee. It's about getting these documents where somebody, if you need to do a survey out there in the middle of construction, you have access to those notes. So you can do your survey and not be slowed down.
Okay. So, okay, next slide. It shall be the responsibility of the governmental agency or others performing construction work to provide for the monumentation required by this section. It shall be the duty of a land surveyor or civil engineer to cooperate with the governmental agency in matters of maps, field notes, and other pertinent records. It's interesting to me because it almost gives me the impression that the governmental agency is looking for, or they can see it out. Maybe saying, oh, it's not our responsibility then, somebody else is performing it. It's in the contract, someone else is doing it, I don't need to worry about it anymore. So it could be one of those things where maybe the government agency isn't really looking at the right way. I think that the government agencies need to understand that they are responsible for it. It's not really an or sort of a situation. They are responsible for it. Also, to what extent does the LS or the CE have to cooperate with the agency? I mean, the agency also needs to cooperate with the LS or the CE, considering that they are the specialists in what they in the work.
And Ray, we have a question that pertains to the previous slide. Monument boxes are raised to the new grade without affecting the monument itself. Is necessary to file the pre- and post-construction corner records?
Well, in my opinion, the answer would be no. You're not required to file those if that monument is not disturbed at all and is always accessible to whoever to use it. But leading to that, I think at that point that the construction is completed, you probably have to file a corner record survey because you might have changed the character of what one expects to see out there. So, changing my answer on the fly there.
There's also another question. What's the purpose of the term devious surveys?
You know, the question you asked what the purpose was. I'm really not in the mind of the legislators at the time they put it in there. All I can say is when I see the term devious surveys, I think that you can be misleading in the work that you do. You need to open, you need to show what you do, and it needs to be available.
Actually, this is Rick. I have another take on that a little bit too. I read devious as if a position of a monument was not perpetuated, there will be other surveys that come in to report to reestablish that position, not knowing where that original position really was, and that reestablished position may end up in a slightly different position or worse. And they will rely upon that reestablished position as being the true location of where the original monument was. That's always been my take on trying to eliminate the occurrence of devious survey.
And I think, Rick, related to that, in my experience in County, we had one particular land surveyor who had several crews doing pre-construction corner records. Well, come to find out at a later date that one of his crews slope taping. They're putting the chain right on the ground instead of doing a traditional brake chain. So if you go back to reset that monument, low standard of care, you can almost say that it might be considered a devious survey because they weren't using accepted standard of care at that time.
And I would consider that a devious survey, whether intended or otherwise, because it not reestablished the position. It didn't take into account the best care to reestablish the position of where that monument originally was. We have a question. AC's put consultant to lower construction costs. What did the land surveyor do without getting fired?
Well, I tell you, we don't have an exact answer to that. I mean, you can make them educate the law, but something we're going to deal with down further in the presentation is a new reporting tool that we have. If we could help you with that, and get that in touch with us so that they understand what the responsibilities are. So why don't we put that question to fully answer later.
We also have another input from a participant that notes that out of way or remote is an accepted definition of devious. We actually ran into a situation like that here recently, where because monuments were destroyed in, a large-scale area, but over a certain block radius, that surveyors were forced to come in from other areas to establish positions from months that weren't used originally, and that can also be considered devious surveys. So thank you for posting that.
Slide here where Larry talked about what the cooperation is, my experience, which has not been the experience we've had with other surveyors here, is that agencies do want to cooperate when they understand what their responsibilities until it gets too late. And we're going to talk about that further on. And we're also going to talk in detail about who it really is on whose responsibility. So with that, we'll go to the next slide here.
Okay, mine is set to mark the limiting lines of highways, roads, streets, or right-of-ways, or easement lines shall not be deemed adequate for this purpose unless specifically noted corner record or record of survey of the improvement works with the rise in bearing or azimuth and distance between these and other monuments of record. I'm still trying to understand the difference between bearings and azimuth, mostly because in complaints and inquiries that I see, rarely do I run into the term azimuth.
Well, it's used in conjunction with this section. We're not going to do a survey lesson because I know most of the surveyors better know what's going on there. When you look at this part of what this is talking about, the image that comes to my mind is, Caltrans' new policy of not really setting centerline monuments on their new highways, or when they go out and rebuild a highway or widen it. They do only set the right-of-way monuments. Now, those right-of-way monuments will be compliance unless they have basically a direction, a tie that relates to the monuments that were destroyed, in which case that brings them into compliance. So here's a case where you've got sufficient control, in my opinion, is being reestablished so that the surveyor who comes on scene can have a good relationship to what the existing monument is, and it's not going to be reset. So
in some sense, it's still perpetuating the original position.
Correct. Correct. And in a more accessible position for the surveyor. You're not going to get in the middle of that freeway.
Not what I meant. Another question related to this. Can you comment on the statement certificate of completion for the project that is found in A 771B?
I can talk about that. Oftentimes with public works projects, they get to a point, and it could be a punch list, it could be a formal letter, but the contractor who's entered into agreement with the agency to do these public works projects won't get that on a paycheck till they get a certificate of compliance in nature. It's not some special form that's out there that we have, we maintain at the board. It's whatever agency has that says that you're fit with your work.
And it's a land survey that's responsible for that, for the certificate of completion? Is the mine part just part of the entire project before the certificate of completion can be?
The certificate of completion is really tied to the improvement project itself. I mean, it could be if your job is specifically just mine preservation independent of the project, and at the time you completed it, they may want to give you a certificate of completion, but it's really points more towards the person creating the improvements that are out there required for maintenance.
Okay. I think this is the last one for 8771. Decision to file either the required corner record or a record of survey pursuant to subdivision B should be at the election of the licensed land surveyor or registered civil engineer submitting the document. The question here, what record is filed? We believe that a record of survey should have been filed.
Well, specific to this section, if it's just purely for perpetuating the monuments that are existing monuments,
8765B or 8762B 1 through 5.
B1 through 5.
Yes.
Don't necessarily apply. Now, in the course of the survey that you're doing, if you find something that triggers 8762B 1 through 5, you have no choice. You need to file a record survey, unless there's the 8765D exception applying. I confuse everybody there.
It's a bigger issue. I mean, if we're talking about strictly monument conservation, if somebody's going out there to preserve a monument, that would most likely just be a corner record, because they're just identifying the location of the monument.
Correct, and that's something maybe that brings I note. Conservation does not always require you to verify what that monument controls. They're very happy to have an idea that it is an existing monument. And you have a responsibility to do research to know what record monuments are actually out there before you go to do this monument conservation. But if you come across a monument that doesn't show on the record, you can tie that out and file a corner record of survey, but you don't necessarily have to validate what that monument purports to do.
So, Ray, in a sense, what you and Larry are saying is that the surveyor, the person authorized to prepare these monuments and file this corner record or record of survey, should be involved early in the process so they can correctly identify what monuments could be affected.
Right on. I'm with you.
Okay.
Let's talk about current issues. And we did our research on this monument conservation. The board's gone through in its history. Years ago, they tried to contact every agency to make them aware of a great problem it was and what a grief problem was some of the words that they were saying. But right now, we're recognizing and understanding this problem. There's a growing understanding, might be a better way to say it. It's a big problem, and it is growing. If you look at the Safe Forum, every now and then you'll see a chat that comes up about it. People are saying, what do I do? How am I going to handle this? And there's no shortage of professionals that give good direction to people. CIA has created the Monument Conservation Committee to deal directly with this issue, and they're working hard with the board and with the Legislative Committee and the Board of Directors of CSA to with creative solutions. And ties into LEDGE committee. See, the LEDGE committee has talked about this more time, and it's still on their to-do list. For practice committees all around the state, from the first practice committee I was involved in Southern California, in Riverside San Bernardino chapter, Orange County chapter, conservation has been one of the top education priorities of those committees, and they've continually educated them and looked at education. And worse, compliance, too. And we talk about compliance up here, BPELSG, the board. We've more and more enforcement inquiries. The board has set up Larry as the man. And conservation is going to come to him. And we put his name out there at every presentation we've had. CSA has recognized him. He's been to LEDGE committee meetings. We're here to help. And another thing to notice is recently some mainstream media has recognized that it's a problem. It's a good thing because people start to understand how it can cost them down the road.
We actually got another good question that comes up once in a while here at the board is, at what level does an object become a monument? Is it just pipe, a tag pipe? And how about the pre-1932 surveys by PEs? I'm sure the significance of pre-1932. I don't know if they meant 1982 or 1932, but...
Yeah, because the engineers weren't in California till, what, 1933?
30, 31, right.
You're right about then.
Okay, but that's what this one is, it's clarified that before the board became effective.
Right. There's records that are out there, and you know, ran into it in my personal practice, you know, place Captain Gully's ties. They've got out there and available, and it's good evidence, and it's good to use. That was down in the Corona area. Now, what's the rest of the question here? When can become a monument? You know, that's really up to the professional to determine that, in my mind. On record, identifies that corner. Say it's a monument, regardless of what it is, if that record has identified that as a monument to that property line. Now, if you go find a concrete nail, no reference, an open pipe, no reference, and I think the surveyor needs to decide whether or not they think it is actually a monument and make that statement they feel it's a monument. In reality, if you're going to do a survey, you'd have to do much more surveying to determine whether or not it has any relationship to anything.
Well, in reference to the pre-1932, what they're trying to say is before engineers were licensed or registered in the state of California. It's an interesting question because prior to that date, only surveyors were licensed to do surveys. And if there were engineers around, they weren't licensed. They weren't surveying. But this is where, in my opinion, the professional judgment of the retracing surveyor comes into play as to what object constitutes a monument. You have to look at the pedigree. You have to look at where this came from. And really, when it comes down to it, it's only the authorized licensee that can make the judgment on whether that's a monument or not until something goes, before a court.
Okay, this current issues, we see surveyors on the back end. There's increased cost to landowners. When there's monuments control property surveys, and often it's discovered several years after the public improvements. And on the chin, surveyors do. When you tell that cost them $5,000 instead of $500, whatever the numbers are, survey so that they can put their fence up between their neighbor. It's good that we recognize that, and we need to find a way to help agencies to understand that as well, and those that are destroying monuments.
Another reason I think is that it's a good idea to have a contact for monument conservation issues, such as Larry, is because prior to this year late last year, whenever I'd become the contact for it, we've received relatively few inquiries about mine preservation here with the board. We had very few complaints about it, and it didn't happen very often either. So since we've established this year, I believe, quite a few. So there's probably been 10 issues I can remember, which I think is encouraging. And every time we've gotten the inquiry and I've contacted an agency regarding the issues that have been observed out in the field, these always seem to be receptive about it. While I know that there could be finger pointing that's going on, or they're trying to say that somebody else might have been responsible for it, none have said that they don't want to help, that they don't want to improve the process. Usually what they're talking about is how they don't think that they were aware that the mine hadn't been preserved. There wasn't proper communication within their agency. Different departments handle different parts of a project, and the departments weren't talking to each other. And then by the time that an issue comes up with a monument not being preserved, it's too late in the cycle. And at that point, you take responsibility. Everybody's saying, well, it wasn't, well, we'll check it next time. Or, well, the department over here is the one that didn't preserve it, so they should be the one that's responsible for it. Nobody really wants to take responsibility for it. Usually when I make a contact with the agency, too, I ask them for a copy of their procedures. In order to ensure that monuments are being preserved. And a few too many times, they don't have procedures. Or they do, but they don't have them documented. What we'll try to do here in our office is help them out in getting procedures put in place. We'll work with them on needs to be put into procedures so that it's documented, and we try to have them work with their agency to make sure that everything is going to be properly communicated, so that everybody knows what's going on to ensure that monuments are being preserved. I think that this is probably one of the biggest parts of the whole problem, is that nobody wants to take responsibility, so nobody wants to pay the money to get monuments reestablished. I think if they knew about this, if they were educated, then they put it into the procedures and know that this has to be handled at the beginning, and it wouldn't cost them nearly as much money to go in the end and try and fix it.
That's something we need to recognize as land surveyors. Public agencies are trying to do more with less. That's a real good term. But the reality is, they set budgets up, they put out the RFP, and once they award a contract, change orders can be pretty traumatic. I mean, to say that they're adverse to change orders is an understatement with some agencies. So the earlier on we can get into the cycle, the better.
Agency turnover doesn't help, especially if nothing is documented. Because if somewhere down the line, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, we talked to somebody, or surveyors had talked to somebody, civil engineers had talked to somebody within an agency and established that you need to take care of this, and that person within the agency says, yeah, you're right, we need to, I'll take care of this from now on, well, then that person leaves. And leave, if there was nothing documented or they didn't tell anybody else about what was going on, well, then we're back to square one again. And people that are in there now don't know anything about it, or nobody's told them that they need to be talking to other department or getting everything straight. So I think that's another part where education, we need to be consistent in letting know that this is a responsibility, a legal responsibility they have to have.
And part of that understanding is, when you talk about these agency costs, whoever's doing the improvements need to understand protecting all the property line infrastructure is more. When you do overall scope, it's to replace the dead infrastructure after it's been destroyed, an exponential number. And let's be clear, the agencies or the individuals performing the work are not responsible for creating the property and infrastructure, but be destroying it. And I think understanding that this infrastructure exists will help to better care for it. And unfortunately, part of that is understanding that they're responsible to do that as well.
Governmental agencies or others performing construction work, I think this goes back to what we talked about earlier when Housing 8771 with governmental agencies wants the buck to others. But when we're talking about a governmental agency, we're talking about the person who's responsible for approving this project. This can be in the form of an engineer, could be a consulting engineer, project engineer. It could be the engineer, surveyor, uptick manager, even within the agency, whether they're licensed or not. If they're approving these works projects, they're responsible for it. Even if someone else is doing it, a contractor is doing it. It's in the check, now the contractor is responsible for it. Well, that's not necessarily true either, because that governmental agency is also responsible.
The representatives, when you talk about project manager, we're really talking about the project manager overseeing the project from the governmental agency's point of view, not once the contract's awarded it at this point. And that could be an unlicensed or licensed contact person that you're running through purchasing, who's this RFP. And that ties into agency executive officer, which you hit the next button there. The reality is, any public official responsible for oversight of these public departments is also responsible. So, let them off the hook. So we're going to talk about others here a little bit. This is not all inclusive, but others. The person that comes to mind is the contractor. And the contractor, the person performing the work. Now, are they authorized to practice land surveying? No. Maybe the CO isn't authorized to practice land surveying either, but still, they have responsibility towards perpetuating these monuments. In that end, we've been working towards collaborating with the Contractors Board. In fact, Rick, if you want to pull it up, we've got we read a meeting with the Contractors Board, and they understand the importance of monument conservation. And here's an article that was in their contractor's bulletin that talks about it and talks about the code, and it talks about how they could be responsible. And the Contractors Board is committed to disciplining individuals to follow through with this. The reality is we've got to educate them, and we've got to bring those cases forward when we find them. And this article will be available after the presentation as archived as well, just a side note. Getting back to the main presentation here, next there. Utility companies, telecommunications, pipelines, water companies, districts, any doing these type of construction projects are responsible as well. Now, the engineer land surveyor is working on the project. I say based on specific details here. If you come into the project and you know it's a problem before it happens, you could be responsible as well. Now, if you've come in well after things have been destroyed, you may not be responsible. So, in a case-by-case basis. So, when it says governmental agencies or others performing construction work, oftentimes people don't know that everyone's responsible until somebody takes care of it. Finger pointing doesn't relieve the responsibility.
So to recap, everyone tries to pass the buck. This is just a list here of people who could be responsible for maintaining monument preservation. Could be one, could be all. Like we're saying, it's a kind of a case-by-case basis, really, in some cases. I think this here goes in with education, where, again, I say that it's important. to know what the role is and ensure that everybody knows what the laws are in order to preserve monuments. I always hate to bring in the law because I'd like to think that it's sort of they could see the obligation they need to have in maintaining the monuments whenever these projects are occurring. PL Act and regulations, these are what I'll use to explain to agencies why they have to do it. Although, again, like I say, they're usually willing to cooperate. It's just a matter of letting them know that to be cooperating. This is something that they have to be putting in their procedures, and it's something that has to be followed through when the projects are going forward. So I just believe that education is essential in this
I agree more, Larry. But
situation.
Along with the laws that requires them, once they're educated, you can also educate them on the benefits of what good monument conservation is. It's going to be a cost savings. There's cost savings to the people providing the work. Because if they destroy monuments and that they need to come in compliance, it's going to cost them a lot more to perpetuate those monuments after they've been destroyed without properly being located prior to construction. Also, understand their role in maintaining property line infrastructure and integrity. If you just destroy those monuments, it is integrity. And I think understand that that benefit is, and it'll be a good public relations for them as far as their improvement project, but what'll help us down the road when we go survey that fence line or future project that needs those monuments.
A couple comments that came in when you guys were talking there. One participant noted that the Green Book addresses this responsibility as well. And I agree with that participant. The Green Book does address this to some degree. It's been my experience that generally the Green Book is more in use in Southern California than it is in Central and Northern California. We had another question that came in for Ray and Larry. Does it mean that surveyors are responsible to reestablish a centerline intersection monument? It was destroyed prior to a project.
Well, it depends on what their involvement was prior to the project. If you come out and the project has destroyed that monument, you're not responsible for perpetuating that monument. But for the survey that you're doing, you may have to reestablish that location in order to properly perform your survey to the standard of care. Make that right?
I think it's that.
Okay.
There's also another question that came in, a comment that says, in some states, monuments for properties, as in property corners, have to be recovered every time there's a change in ownership, so a property transaction. Would that requirement in California help bring public awareness about survey monuments?
I'll take that one, Rick. I was yes. And on my experience, actually with one local agency down in Southern California, as part of a building permit requirement for any improvements to your existing home, where you increase the footprint of your structure, adding on a awning or maybe expanding a room, that local agency in their building requirements require that all the corners be located and document filed with the county fair. Well, that brought just a wave of corner records and records of surveys to the County of Orange. And even still today, and there weren't many monuments out there, so there was a lot of rehabilitating of the infrastructure, you might say, that needed to go on. And it's still going on, but it's improving leaps and bounds at this point, starting to see the benefit of that. So anything that would go towards that, I personally would support. And the reality is it's going to benefit the owner. I mean, if they turn a site plan for a remodel, they're generally required to show that property line on there because the agency wants to make sure they're not encroaching on the property line or the setback. Oftentimes it's a false sense of security if that line isn't identified by someone authorized to practice land surveying. Matter of fact, it could be in violation, but that's another subject we'll talk on at a future date. So, where else?
Where we can help is inquiries to Larry, where I can contact agencies to advise them of their responsibilities. I provide them with assistance in how to comply and preserve monuments. I also work with Rick and with Ray to provide them with suggested language to include in their procedures or in their contracts to ensure the perpetuation of monuments. Basically, try to help them to understand their role, and they can help here. Well, also, I think we're going to be preparing a general letter that we'll be sending to government agencies, utilities, districts, just to keep them informed and let them know what their role is at that point.
One of the challenges in that general level area is finding out who to send a letter to. That's something we're looking to partner with CIAC, League of Cities, local professional practice committees, any contacts that they might have, sending out some type of inquiry so we can create a database that will be difficult to maintain because things change so fast. Mm-hmm. But we're going to give it the best shot to get that general letter out there.
Right. Make this as proactive as we possibly can.
I have a couple new questions for you guys. One is a very good question, I think. Would it be incumbent on a contractor to know of all monuments that exist in an area of construction, even if they are not shown on improvement drawings?
I think I said it earlier, but the reality is the responsibility to all record documents to find out what you expect to find out there. I'm not talking about the construction plans. I'm talking about the final maps, records of surveys, corner records, any that may be on file with your county surveyor. No, I'm not talking about notes that you may not have access to reasonable.
Take that a little bit further. I believe it's incumbent upon the contractor and ultimately the agency performing work to hire a land surveyor to properly document what monuments exist and whether they need to be referenced out and taken care of according to 8771B. I have another question. If a monument has been paved over at some point in the past, it's incumbent upon the agency to preserve that monument during a current repaving project. I think yes. Anything to add to that? I definitely think if an agency paved over something in the past, just because it was in the past doesn't mean they're not still responsible for taking care of that monument.
That's like a similar issue we run into at the board, where a previous surveyor should have filed a record of survey, and then because 8762B 1 through 5 was triggered that requirement, they filed nothing. Then you go out there, and if they would have filed their record of survey or corner record, you wouldn't have had to file something. Reality is, you're still able to do that because it wasn't filed by the other person.
According to our research and we have in our office is these ones, as Ray mentioned earlier in this broadcast, is that they've been around since the late 50s. And language really hasn't changed much, and there's really no reason why you should not be aware of these. Also, another question, does the whole agency preparing for an improvement project, they should be responsible for all monuments within the area of construction on a project?
Talk about the area of construction. I think you need to look at just it's in an area. On the construction is going to affect that monument or destroy that monument. They really don't need to perpetuate it. It's just the monument happens to be in the area. Now, you need to take a reasonable look at the plans to see what expected, rub zone is, or where that sewer line is going to be saw cut through the pavement. But if it's close, it's that professional judgment. And if the scope of the project changes during the project, that doesn't mean they're off the hook. They need to readjust and perpetuate those monuments that do exist.
Another comment that came in is, if the local agency doesn't do their job properly and locate all existing monuments, the contractor most likely will not either. One point. It's also important to understand that in reality, for the agency and for the contractor, if there's one involved, they really need to remember one thing. They need to protect monuments. They need a surveyor to tell them if there's any monuments there to protect. That's it. Got another question. My employer did everything possible to limit the number of monuments to find and perpetuate. Most civil engineering, land surveying firms similar. I'm taking that as they try to find the minimal amount of monuments to perpetuate. And that question sounds like to me. And I think where it comes back to the language 771B about sufficient controlling monuments. And Larry and Ray may want to add to this because we talked about it earlier.
It says sufficient monuments shall be reset in the new construction. Monuments that exist need to be located. The sufficient applies to after the fact. There needs to be sufficient monuments put back in place. There needs to be a record of all monuments that existed prior to the construction. Had experience with other firms? Personally, no. I guess to really understand that, we'd have to get input from other people that work for firms. The reality is, if we were to get information, inquiries to us, then maybe we could direct them over to Larry or the other arm that Larry works for, our enforcement unit, to investigate and have a more focused education of those firms' responsibilities. All this actually tends to go back to something we haven't mentioned, and that's the contract that the profession has for providing monument conservation or perpetuating existing monuments. Once you understand the responsibilities, the key is to contract in place so that they understand what is and what's being provided. A lot of times they'll say, we're going to budget for 13 monuments, and we'll give you 1,000 per monument. Now, I know that's the high numbers, that's not realistic, but they do a per monument and they cap you. That contract, that's not allowable. It'd be based more on what you find. Maybe so. Even beyond that, I recommend agencies do the search to find out what's there and give much money to find it and take away incentives of only paying you when you actually find the monument. It takes effort out there and look for existing monuments that may not be there anymore.
We have another question, a couple comments coming in. Subcontract surveyor, responsible or assume responsibility for in subsequent laying out of construction, identifying any newly found monuments, and follow up on that.
I guess I'm not quite understanding the question.
Well, I can tell you how I'm taking it. I'm taking it as the strides for improvement project of doing the preservation and doing appropriately, and they start the construction work, and there's another surveyor hired to do the layout work and the construction staking on that project. And during the course of that construction staking, that surveyor finds a monument that was not previously discovered. Should that surveyor be responsible for that monument and preserving it according to A771B at that time?
Everybody is responsible until that monument's perpetuated. I think back to that or in the law. Beaten by groups, one of the people. Well, it is everybody's on the hook with that.
Okay, another question. So are you telling me that all existing monuments must be located? And that I was saying in response to that earlier was that if the surveyor, again, the contractor and the agency are responsible for bringing in an appropriately licensed person to identify if there are any monuments that are in danger of being disturbed or destroyed as a result of this future improvement project. I think the fair is responsible for identifying which monuments could be affected, and I think any of them that could be more definite should be referenced off, located, corner record filed, and should be done in accordance with A771B. So if it's an extra couple monuments, take time to do it then. The whole idea of this is, be it a public agency or a licensee or a contractor, it's incumbent upon all those parties involved to protect those interests, and that they're doing this by protecting the property line infrastructure by preserving these monuments.
I agree.
What if there is not given enough time for the search? Something that progressed on a case-by-case basis would be to take those questions probably in line of this webinar. Question, what are responsibilities regarding, 1, researching records to find monuments, and 2, documenting the record pedigree of a monument on a corner record?
You know, I think you don't have to document the pedigree of what that monument is on the corner record, but if you choose to, there's nothing that prevents you from doing that.
I think appropriate times to do it, and there's times when it not be what you're trying to do. If you see a monument that's being destroyed, you're a surveyor, you're out there on a project, and you see a monument that's getting ready to be destroyed, tie off, preserve it, preserve that location. At point. Later, if you're going to file a corner record on that, and you can put the record information, that's important. Record information is important to determine the monument really is a monument, or how we establish the position of where that monument was, then I think it's appropriate. If all you can do is tie off that monument and put it back in the same spot, regardless of what it's trying to control, then there may be a time then you don't necessarily have to have record information.
You do not need to, but the reality is you have research to begin with. And so you have a research on a monument, you find what's there, or something doesn't match the record, I recommend that you know the reference on your corner record.
And it's, as I mentioned earlier, the records to find the monuments, that's necessarily the agency's responsibility or the contractor's responsibility. Again, their responsibility is to recognize what laws they have to follow, which in this case means hiring a land surveyor to take care of the situation. Now, the agency may have a land surveyor on staff, in which case the agency's responsibility is to research those records.
I agree. But we're going to switch gears here. We're going to talk a little about the next step in our education. And we're developing a web-based reporting tool where you can inform us what's going on out there, basically. And by informing us in a timely manner, why don't you hit the next button there? You know, we promptly contact the agency regarding monument conservation for specific projects. This isn't a general letter, this is a specific project letter. And it may be in different phases of the project. It could be in front of the council, it could be an RFP's been let. But prior to it. Now, you know, this is a little ahead, but that's fine. When you report to us, we'll send you a copy of what we send to that agency or that person, that individual, back to you. To get this is through our website. We're going to show you a draft page here of what our tool is going to look like. We're working on it now and bring it up there. We're going to have a web page on our site that talks about survey monument conservation, reporting of upcoming public works or improvement projects. We're going to talk a little bit why you should do it, and then have you to fill in some information. Now, we're going to decide a certain minimum amount of information that you give to us, but happen is you'll fill in these boxes. You have to provide a certain amount. The more you provide us, the better. And also, we're going to, at the bottom, attach a copy of the RFP or any other documents. Give us your contact information. Now, you could do this anonymous, as in anything, any reporting. But, unfortunately, if you do anonymous, we may not be able to contact you for follow-up to get better information so that we can, provide service we need to educate that. So, this up here, I don't know if you can see any comments, but there'll be comments on it through presentation and later dates. So this is a tool we're looking to update.
And keep in mind, this is a work in progress. It's really a rough draft at this point. We're working with both the staff here at the board and DCA's internet team to put the form up on the website as soon as we can. The idea is not necessarily to replace the consumer complaint form, though in some cases, just by providing this information, it may just board staff into opening up a case, an investigation. The idea of this is to notify us of something that you're aware of and that you need our help and our assistance in making sure that the agency, the contractor, whoever it is adhering to the laws and complying with it in regards to 8771B.
Now, this information, what are we going to do with it? How specifically?
Well, this information that gets to us will then be put into a letter. And what we do is prepare a letter with the information I'm given, and it's going to be sent to the agency. It's going to reference a specific project, which is why this is different than the other letter we had mentioned earlier. This one more specific to a project, and it will be asking the agency for information about it. So, for example, you provide information because a public works project that's to be done, and when you're looking at the RFP, you see that there's nothing in there about conserving any monuments or preserving any monuments. So we're worried about that. You provide information to us based on that RFP and the agency that's involved with it. I'll then prepare a letter like this. I'll send it to the agency, and I'll ask them for more information about that project. I'll ask them if there's anything in it about the monument conservation, what's being done with that. It's more of a tool for us to try to catch it a little bit earlier, instead of the project happening and then afterwards it's that there weren't any, that the monuments weren't headed for. We're going to try and catch this one a little bit earlier with the agency to make sure that they're take care of that. I'm moving ahead with.
Well, we have another question, Larry.
Oh, we do.
And actually, it's very pertinent to you.
Okay.
Has any agency ever been made to go back and after surfacing and replace covered or destroyed monuments? I've been at monuments in the pavement for 30 plus years and never seen it happen.
Yes.
I'm going to expand on what Larry said there.
Yeah. We have seen it, that we have contacted agencies after this was done, and this was via complaint cases. We have seen them go back and replace these monuments. This sort of came up about the time I was coming into enforcement unit, so I don't know what was being taken care of beforehand. But afterwards, after they were notified, they have gone back and placed some of those monuments.
And appropriate records.
And filed appropriate corner records.
That kind of ties into what this purpose of this reporting for us can be. We don't have the staff to go read a newspaper or look at every county to see what's going on within your jurisdiction. Know something's coming down the pike. You can get information where Larry can, this information will go to Larry. He can process it, see if it needs a follow-up, see if he sends what is a basic form letter that might be tailored to them, their specific project, and maybe the situation, so we can get quickly. And so it can be put on notice that, hey, you need to take care of this prop line infrastructure. Now, they have policies and procedures in place that don't show in the RFP. Maybe they want to develop some. We can assist them in that. Maybe they didn't understand, and we've actually had a couple cases where RFPs have been pulled off the market, retooled them, and re-let out with the buffer. The point is, if we get the information quick enough, we can partner with the agencies to make sure they comply, and understand it's much easier to comply until after those mines have been destroyed and have to go back and perpetuate them.
I know several situations that have come in with Larry here where they've ranged anywhere from one monument to many monuments, close to 100. And if the monument surveyor simply had Larry's contact information from earlier presentations, emailed Larry pictures of the paved over monuments and a map showing where it was. Larry contacted the agency and asked them to take care of it, and it's our understanding they took care of it very quickly. There's been cases where Larry's been tracking it and monitoring it on a regular basis, some cases very patiently, trying to make sure that it's all being taken care of, and they're replaced or restored on a regular interval. The situation, as I mentioned earlier, that my practice in California was primarily the Ventura, Santa Barbara, LA area, and I know that the city of Oxnard and the city of Ventura both have very strong monument conservation or preservation efforts in place. They both have city surveyors, and I've been made aware of that in Oxnard there was even one case where the city was very successful in having a utility company hire a surveyor to replace over 700 property corners. It's very expensive after the fact, but the city had withheld final payment to that utility company as leverage until that happened. There are success stories out there in the state, ones that probably are not even aware of ourselves.
And this goes back to what I was mentioning earlier, how we didn't receive a whole lot of inquiries until this monument preservation contact was established earlier this year. Because ever since that's been established, we've had pretty good results in when I've contacted them and informed them of monuments that were missed, and then going out and replacing them.
Something's really not often talked about, Larry, and I think I'm going to bring it up. I'm sorry to interrupt you there, but a lot in different jurisdictions, surveyors are very remiss to turn an agency that work for them. Violation. They've been for years. Let's say something, they fear they won't get that next staking job. They might not get that next preliminary survey. And I've heard that from more than one person. And they want to come in and investigate the area without telling us anything that's going on. Unfortunately, we need some specific information of some sort, and then hopes a way that we can educate them as their responsibilities. Because Lancers a lot of times do not want to make formal complaints or make inquiries in such that we could open a complaint so we can work towards compliance with the law. This board does the resources to go do that. We do, and the layers are the ones who best know what a survey monument is when there's you out there and communicate it to us. In the letter, what'll follow up, you want to go to the slide, Rick? Is, follow us. What happens if those monuments are destroyed, even as this letter went out?
What will happen is if once I contact the agency and let them know this, they respond back, we're taking care of it. Since you're out there, let it's been taken care of. If you notice that the agencies don't appear to be addressing the concerns, let me know so that I can follow up with the agency about it, whether that's going to be just calling them back and finding out what's going on. Sometimes we're going to need to file a complaint because they haven't followed up with it, but either way, we do follow up. Once you submit the information to me on the form, And the letter, I'll also send you back confirmation that the letter's been sent, just so that you know that. And from that point forward, you follow up with it and then let me know whether it's been taken care of. They usually tell me too, but just in case they don't, let me know too.
From experience that when I does hear from a land surveyor that the monument was restored and everything was taken care of, he's walking around here a lot more proudly of what's going on. He's thinking the process is actually working.
But when you get bottom line, Rick, it will seek compliance if we know what's going on. Is there another pop up there?
Yeah, this has popped up. Only more of a comment. What's this from would be make monument preservation part of Caltrans right-of-way certification. Certification is required for all state and federal funded projects. We require the agency to file our RS or corner record as a requirement of this certification. Agencies need to prove that utilities have been relocated and all the right-of-way has been acquired prior to funding. So it's a suggestion on where we can also interject this requirement.
I'm sure the Monument Conservation Committee will hear this transcript and take a look into that.
Yeah, that's actually a good idea.
Well, comments are good.
Yeah.
We want comments.
Combine, let's get together to save survey monuments. Rick's favorite new quote is above the law and no below it. Nor do we man's permission when we ask him to obey it. Theodore Roosevelt, but it applies here and something that we have to deal with on a regular basis. And we're not ashamed to do that.
So I have a comment, and you may want to address this. Just for clarity, my understanding of what has been said today is that all the monuments in place must be out, but we would not be required to replace them all, just a sufficient number in our professional opinion.
Certainly for what you said, I would say that answer is correct. You've got to look at standard of care, like I mentioned earlier. Just because you put 2 monuments in the ground after you've topped 50 monuments doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be sufficient. That to partner with a local agency, maybe the county fair, if you're not planning on reestablishing every monument, to see what they feel is sufficient. Because the reality is, someone file a complaint against you, and then we're going to investigate it, and the subject expert could take a look at that and that you didn't adhere to the right standard of care.
It's important to understand that as the professional land surveyor, as licensee, that is placed to protect the public's interest in this regard, it's not necessarily what your opinion of sufficient is that you need to consider. You need to consider the public's indication of what's going to be sufficient. Is it help the property owners? Is it going to help the public in its entirety if it's within the public right-of-way? That's what you need to consider. It's not your own personal preference. Also, when you say all monuments in place must be taken out, elaborate a little bit on that. If you're talking a repaving project that's going to resurface from face to curb face all the way down, monuments that can be affected by that within that roadway could be affected. They probably all need to be tied out. However, if you're coming through and you're putting a new water line and you're going to trench through an existing roadway, you need to consider which monuments could be affected by that construction work. If monuments are far enough away from the trench and they're not going to be affected by this construction work, then you necessarily need to tie those out. So you have to use your professional judgment. It's like a comment, agencies know that they are responsible and cannot dump it off on the contractor. The agency should contract directly with the land surveyor.
From the presentation, you've understood that all are responsible until somebody does it. That's what we're here to educate and help. In this here, we'll have it. Here's contact information. You can contact Larry, myself, Rick, and the person that we haven't mentioned today, but Nancy Eisler. She heads up enforcement unit, as well as Tammy, our PLS board member, as we'll have that contact information together. Right, coming to the end of our presentation here, and we'll stay here if there's any questions or comments. As they're coming up, I want to thank everybody for their questions and participation in this webinar. It makes it more useful for all of us. We appreciate that. And just to note, any of the questions, responses, and attention you've seen today are going to be provided with the archive of this webinar. And any further questions that we might not have addressed, we'll look at those as well.
And we have one right now.
Okay.
Does the board have the financial resources to send the compliance letter shown earlier to every civil engineer and professional land surveyor? This may help us convince others to follow the law. Well, we talked about two different letters. In reality, we talked about a general letter that we're going to try to get out to all the agencies with the assistance of the CLSA, JPPC committees that have this local contact information. We would like that out en masse to everyone. And as the other letter where Larry, in response to someone reporting on an inquiry to the board, that letter will be going out to that agency responsible, or agencies or contractor or whoever it is, and Larry will provide that to the person who made the inquiry. But the general letter that we want to send out as much as we can, I have no reason why we can't provide that to anyone, for it to anyone and everyone, as Ray says, make sure it gets out there. We can post it on the CLSA forum, we can give it to SEAC, we can give it to League, we can give it to anyone to make sure that it gets out there, because, and some of you may already know this, a letter was sent out back in the 80s, 70s, to all agencies in this regard, and as Larry mentioned earlier, with the turnover through these agencies, what happens is people forget it. They don't implement policies and procedures. We like what we're doing today, we're going to be end up doing 5 10 years from now again, too. So it's important to have this education out there. So yes, we would like to have your help. We'll try to get it out to where it's available for everybody to be able to duplicate and pass around. Any questions or comments anyone wants to express at this time?
At the CLSA Central Office, and we'd just like to thank Rick and Ray and Larry for taking the time to share this information. And we're pleased to be able to offer this service to CLSA members complimentary as a member benefit. We will be archiving this webinar. It's been recorded. We'll be archiving it along with the PowerPoint and the question and answers. And it'll be posted on the CLSA's members-only website in about a week.
Thank Christy and CLA, too, for setting this up. Couldn't have done it without you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Don't have to go home. You can't stay here.